Hello, this is Professor April Dawson, and this is a recorded lecture on executive privilege. What is executive privilege? Executive privilege is the ability of the President to keep conversations with or memoranda to or from advisors secret. Why is there a need for executive privilege? Executive privilege is necessary for the President to receive candid advice. If the President or the President's advisors believe that the content of their conversations will become public, they may not be quite as candid about the information that they're talking about or the advice being given. Executive privilege also helps to protect national security, and diplomacy is one of those areas that's regarded as requiring secrecy. What type of power is executive privilege? Is it constitutional? Is it statutory? We know from our earlier discussion that when the President acts, the President is acting either pursuant to constitutional authority or statutory authority, or is exercising inherent power. And executive privilege is basically another example of inherent authority, because the Constitution does not expressly mention executive privilege. Nor is there a statute that the President can point to that authorizes the exercise of executive privilege. So executive privilege is an inherent authority. Who decides whether the exercise of executive privilege is permissible, the President or the court? And this was basically the issue in United States v. Nixon. United States v. Nixon was a 1974 case. It was a unanimous decision, and the court in that case was having to determine whether President Nixon was able to exercise executive privilege. So as you're aware, United States v. Nixon arose following indictments in the Watergate affair, and the special prosecutor who had been appointed was seeking the audio tapes of conversations recorded by Nixon in the Oval Office. Nixon refused to turn over the tapes, and he claimed that he was immune from the subpoena because he had executive privilege, which he was exercising. So the threshold issue in this case was who decides whether the Constitution provides for executive privilege, whether the privilege even exists in the first place. Does the court decide that, or does the President? And the court concluded that, not surprisingly, that it's for the court to determine whether the Constitution provides the President with executive privilege. So then the next question was, does the President in fact have executive privilege? Does the Constitution in fact provide for it? And the court reached the conclusion that yes, the President does have executive privilege. And the court noted that there is no explicit reference to a privilege of confidentiality in the Constitution, but for the effective discharge of the President's power, executive privilege needed to exist. And in finding that there was executive privilege, the court noted that the President needed to receive candid advice, and without executive privilege, he would not be able to discharge his constitutional duties and obligations. So then the next question for the court was whether the exercise of executive privilege was reviewable by the court, or did the President have an absolute unqualified executive privilege that could not be reviewed by the court? The court noted that while the President's exercise of executive privilege should be afforded great deference by the court, it was not an absolute and unqualified privilege, and that the President's exercise of the executive privilege could be reviewed by the courts. The court noted that documents and audio tapes could be reviewed in chambers, and that would address security concerns in the event a president is claiming the requested information is confidential. And that way the information could remain secret, at least from the public. The court also noted that an absolute unqualified executive privilege would prevent the court from adjudicating cases before it. The next question that the court addressed was whether Nixon could exercise his executive privilege in this case and refused to produce the audio tapes. In deciding this issue, the court noted that Nixon was not basing his claim on privilege on a ground that they were military or diplomatic secrets. The court noted that the president was only making a generalized interest in confidentiality. The court further noted that no case of the court had extended such a high degree of deference that the president was asking for to a generalized claim of privilege. In answering this question, the court also considered constitutional rights in criminal trials and the defendant's right to all of the evidence. The court noted the Sixth Amendment, which provided that every defendant in a criminal trial has a right to be confronted with the witnesses against him and to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor. And the court also noted the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees that no person shall be deprived of liberty without due process of law. And if you can't have access to information, one may be deprived of their liberty, so they might be imprisoned, without due process of law. So in deciding this issue, the court balanced the general privilege of confidentiality of the president's communication against the fair administration of criminal justice, and the court found that the latter, the fair administration of criminal justice, outweighed the president's general privilege of confidentiality. And thus the court concluded that Nixon could not exercise his executive privilege and he had to turn over the audio tapes. And as we know, after the production of the audio tapes, there were impeachment proceedings that were initiated against Nixon. And before the impeachment by the House could get underway, Nixon resigned. All right, so that concludes this recorded lecture on executive privilege. Thank you for your attention.